He was a respected attorney with impeccable credentials. But when James Washington walked into that courtroom, Officer Sloan saw only one thing. Handcuffed and humiliated in front of everyone, James maintained his dignity. What happened next shocked the entire legal system. From a single act of racism emerged a conspiracy involving corrupt officials, powerful corporations, and a community fighting to preserve its legacy. One man stood up against the system and changed everything. Watch as James Washington transforms personal humiliation into justice for an entire community. Should corporations be allowed to target minority businesses? Share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to see more stories of justice being served. Attorney James Washington straightened his tie as he walked up the courthouse steps at 7 a.m. Today marked his first major case since joining the prestigious Barrett and Mills law firm in Atlanta. At 34, James had worked relentlessly to build his reputation after graduating top of his class from Howard University Law School. Morning James, called Terrence, the elderly security guard who'd quickly become a friendly face during James's prep visits. Big day, huh? Biggest of my career so far, James replied with a warm smile. My client's counting on me. James represented Marcus Coleman, a small business owner facing trumped-up fraud charges after refusing to sell his property to a large development company. The evidence was flimsy at best, but the development company had powerful connections. Inside the courthouse, James reviewed his notes one final time. His mother had called last night to wish him luck. She'd raised him alone after his father died in military service, instilling in him a fierce sense of justice and determination. Mr. Washington, a young paralegal approached. They're ready for you in courtroom C. James gathered his materials and headed toward the courtroom. The hallway bustled with the usual morning activity, clerks rushing documents, lawyers consulting with clients, officers escorting defendants. Officer Derek Sloan leaned against the wall near the courtroom entrance. A 15-year veteran of the courthouse security detail, Sloan had developed a reputation among the staff for his harsh treatment of certain visitors, particularly those who weren't white. As James approached the courtroom doors, Sloan straightened up, his eyes narrowing. "Excuse me," James said politely, attempting to pass. Sloan stepped directly in front of him. "Where do you think you're going?" "Into the courtroom. I'm representing the defendant in the Coleman case." Sloan snorted. "Yeah, right, let me see some ID." James maintained his composure despite the disrespect in Sloan's tone. "Certainly." He produced his bar association card and driver's license. Sloan barely glanced at them. "These could be fake. You think you're the first person to try pulling this? Defendants need to enter through the side door with their court-appointed attorney." "I'm not the defendant. I'm the defense attorney, as my credentials clearly show," James replied calmly, though his jaw tightened. "And Mr. Coleman has retained me privately. Listen, I've been working here since before you were old enough to vote. I know who belongs where." Sloan's voice grew louder, drawing attention from others in the hallway. "No way some young." James cut him off. "I understand you're doing your job, Officer Sloan, but I am an attorney with Barrett and Mills. If you check the docket, you'll see I'm listed as counsel for Mr. Coleman." "I don't need to check anything." Sloan's hand moved to his handcuffs. "Now you can either walk out the way you came in or we're going to have a problem." Several bystanders had stopped to watch the confrontation. James noticed a court clerk looking on with concern but not intervening. "This is unacceptable," James said firmly. "I'm going to be late for my case." "That's it." Sloan grabbed James's wrist. "Put your hands behind your back. You're interfering with court operations." "This is absurd. I'm an attorney," James protested as Sloan roughly cuffed his hands behind his back, causing his briefcase to fall and scatter important case documents across the floor. "Sure you are," Sloan sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "And I'm the Attorney General." The commotion drew more attention as Sloan pushed James toward the courtroom doors. "Let's see what the judge has to say about your little charade." James maintained his dignity despite the humiliation, knowing that losing his composure would only make things worse. As Sloan shoved him through the courtroom doors, several gasps erupted from the gallery. Judge Evelyn Harmon looked up from her bench, her eyes widening at the scene unfolding before her. "Officer Sloan," she called out sharply. "What is the meaning of this?" "Your Honor," Officer Sloan announced proudly, "I caught this man attempting to impersonate an attorney and gain unauthorized access to your courtroom." Judge Evelyn Harmon's piercing gaze shifted between the handcuffed James and the smug officer. The courtroom had fallen completely silent. "And what evidence led you to this conclusion, Officer Sloan?" Judge Harmon asked, her voice carrying a dangerous edge that the more experienced courtroom regulars immediately recognized. "He claimed to be representing the Coleman case, Your Honor. I know all the attorneys who work this courthouse, and I've never seen this man before." Sloan's chest puffed out slightly. "When I questioned his credentials, he became belligerent." James remained silent, his face a mask of composed dignity despite the handcuffs digging into his wrists and the humiliation of being paraded before a packed courtroom. I see, Judge Harmon said, removing her reading glasses. And did you bother to check the court docket before handcuffing him? With all due respect, Your Honor, I've been working security here for 15 years. I know an attorney when I see one. Sloane's confidence began to waver slightly at the judge's tone. Judge Harmon's expression hardened. Release Mr. Washington immediately. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Sloane's face. Ma'am, you heard me, officer. Remove those handcuffs now. Her voice carried such authority that several people in the gallery straightened in their seats. Sloane hesitated, then reluctantly moved to unlock the handcuffs. James rubbed his wrists as he was released, maintaining his professional demeanor despite the situation. Mr. Washington, Judge Harmon addressed him directly, please accept the court's sincere apologies for this egregious treatment. Thank you, Your Honor, James replied with dignity. A court clerk had already gathered James's scattered documents and approached with his briefcase. Judge Harmon wasn't finished. Officer Sloan approached the bench. The officer stepped forward, his earlier confidence evaporating with each step. Perhaps you're unaware, Officer Sloan, but Mr. James Washington is not only a licensed attorney but a highly respected one. He graduated with honors from Howard University Law School and was recently made junior partner at Barrett and Mills, one of the most prestigious firms in this city. Sloane's face began to pale. The courtroom remained silent, everyone transfixed by the unfolding scene. Furthermore, Judge Harmon continued, her voice growing icier. Mr. Washington clerked for Justice Reynolds at the state Supreme Court and has argued successfully before the Federal Court of Appeals. His legal articles have been published in the Harvard Law Review, and he volunteers 20 hours monthly at the Legal Aid Clinic helping those who cannot afford representation. Sloan swallowed hard, a bead of sweat now visible on his forehead. But beyond his impressive credentials, Officer Sloan, Mr. Washington has every right to be in this courtroom regardless of his appearance or your personal assessment of who looks like an attorney. Whispers began to circulate through the courtroom. Some of the regular attorneys exchanged knowing glances, sensing there was more to come. I wonder, Judge Harmon said, leaning forward slightly, if you would have questioned a white attorney in the same manner. Would you have handcuffed them without verification? Would you have publicly humiliated them? Your Honor, I was just trying to. I'm not finished, officer. The judge's interruption was sharp enough to make Sloan flinch. What makes your actions particularly troubling is that you and I have had this conversation before, twice in fact, following similar incidents with other black legal professionals. Murmurs grew louder in the gallery. James stood quietly, his expression unreadable as he straightened his suit jacket. But what you evidently failed to recognize, Officer Sloan, Judge Harmon continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow carried throughout the entire courtroom, is that Mr. Washington isn't just any attorney. She paused, letting the tension build. Mr. Washington is my nephew. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Sloan's face drained of all remaining color. And while I would never allow our family relationship to influence any case he argues in my courtroom, which is precisely why he rarely appears before me, I am intimately familiar with the dedication and sacrifice it took for him to earn his place in this profession. Judge Harmon glanced at the court clerk. Ms. Rivera, please contact the head of courthouse security and the county sheriff. I want Officer Sloan removed from this courthouse immediately pending a full investigation. Yes, Your Honor, Ms. Rivera replied, already reaching for the phone. Your Honor, please, Sloan began, panic now evident in his voice. You are dismissed, officer. Surrender your courthouse credentials to security at the main entrance before you leave. Judge Harmon's tone made it clear the discussion was over. This court will be in recess for 15 minutes while Mr. Washington prepares for his case. As Sloan was escorted out by two other officers who had entered during the judge's speech, whispers erupted throughout the courtroom. James straightened his tie, nodded respectfully to his aunt on the bench, and moved to the defense table to prepare his notes. The damage to Officer Sloan's career had just begun. The 15-minute recess stretched to 30 as courthouse security processed Officer Sloan's removal. When Judge Harmon finally returned to the bench, the courtroom had filled to capacity, news of the morning's drama having spread throughout the building. Court is now in session, announced the bailiff. All rise for the Honorable Judge Evelyn Harmon. James stood at the defense table beside his client, Marcus Coleman, a 42-year-old small business owner whose barbershop had been a community fixture for nearly 2 decades. Though visibly nervous, Coleman carried himself with quiet dignity. Be seated, Judge Harmon instructed. Before we proceed with the Coleman case, I wish to address the incident that occurred earlier. While Officer Sloan has been removed from duty, I want to state clearly for the record that my familial relationship with Mr. Washington will not influence these proceedings in any way. She turned to the prosecution table. Ms. Winters, would the prosecution have any objection to my continuing to preside over this case given the circumstances? Prosecutor Allison Winters, a sharp woman in her mid-40s, stood. "No objection, Your Honor. The prosecution acknowledges your record of impartiality and has full confidence in your ability to adjudicate this matter fairly." "Thank you, Mr. Washington. Does the defense wish to request my recusal?" James rose. "No, Your Honor. The defense is confident in the court's ability to render fair judgment." "Very well. Let's proceed with opening statements. Ms. Winters." Prosecutor approached the jury box with practiced confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is straightforward. The defendant, Marcus Coleman, submitted fraudulent loan applications to finance his business expansion, deliberately misrepresenting his financial situation and the value of his property. The evidence will show that Mr. Coleman inflated his income, concealed existing debts, and falsified property assessments to secure funds he had no reasonable ability to repay." She paced before the jury, her expression grave. "The prosecution will demonstrate that these weren't simple clerical errors or misunderstandings, but calculated acts of fraud designed to obtain hundreds of thousands of dollars under false pretenses. Thank you." As Winters returned to her seat, James took a deep breath and approached the jury. Despite the earlier incident, his composure remained intact. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice calm yet resonant, "what Ms. Winters has described would indeed be fraud if any of it were true." He paused, letting the statement settle. "The defense will show that Marcus Coleman has operated his business with impeccable financial integrity for nearly 20 years. Far from committing fraud, Mr. Coleman was the victim of a deliberate scheme to devalue his property and force him into an impossible financial position." James gestured toward his client. "Mr. Coleman's barbershop sits on the last piece of family-owned property in what has become prime real estate for Westridge Development Corporation. After Mr. Coleman refused multiple lowball offers to sell, a pattern of harassment began." Several jurors leaned forward, their interest piqued. "You'll see evidence that Westridge representatives, including their CFO Kenneth Phillips, who sits beside Ms. Winters today as a consultant to the prosecution, orchestrated a campaign to drive Mr. Coleman out. They pressured the bank to reappraise his property at half its market value. They influenced city inspectors to find trivial violations. And when Mr. Coleman still wouldn't sell, they manufactured these fraud allegations." James walked closer to the jury box. The prosecution's key witness, Loan Officer Thomas Briggs, approved Mr. Coleman's original application without issue. Only after a private meeting with Westridge executives did he suddenly discover supposed discrepancies. "We'll show you communications proving Mr. Briggs was promised a lucrative position at Westridge in exchange for his cooperation." A subtle murmur ran through the courtroom. Kenneth Phillips shifted uncomfortably in his seat beside the prosecutor. "This case isn't about fraud," James continued. "It's about a powerful corporation using its influence to crush a small business owner who stood in the way of their development plans. It's about wealth and connections being leveraged to manipulate our justice system." He returned to the defense table and placed a hand on Coleman's shoulder. "Marcus Coleman didn't commit fraud. He committed the offense of refusing to be bullied out of his family legacy. By the end of this trial, I'm confident you'll agree that Mr. Coleman deserves justice, not prosecution. Thank you." As James sat down, the energy in the courtroom had noticeably shifted. Judge Harmon glanced briefly at the prosecution table, where Allison Winters was whispering urgently to Kenneth Phillips. "The prosecution may call its first witness," Judge Harmon announced. "The prosecution calls Thomas Briggs," Winters replied. As the loan officer took the stand and was sworn in, James noticed a slight tremor in the man's hands. Briggs avoided eye contact with everyone in the courtroom, especially Kenneth Phillips. James opened his notebook to the section on Briggs, revealing printed copies of emails and text messages his investigator had uncovered, communications between Briggs and Westridge executives that the prosecution had conveniently failed to disclose during discovery. Across the courtroom, Officer Sloan's dramatic removal seemed forgotten as a much bigger story began to unfold. Whatever confidence Prosecutor Winters had displayed during her opening statement now appeared considerably diminished as she approached her suddenly nervous star witness. Thomas Briggs fidgeted on the witness stand as Prosecutor Winters approached. His formerly crisp white shirt now showed sweat stains beneath the arms, and he repeatedly adjusted his tie. "Mr. Briggs, please state your occupation for the record," Winters began. "I'm a senior loan officer at First Capital Bank," Briggs replied, his voice barely audible. "Could you speak up for the jury?" Judge Harmon instructed. Briggs cleared his throat. "Senior loan officer at First Capital Bank, I've been there 9 years. And in your position, did you review Mr. Coleman's loan application for his business expansion?" "Yes, I did." Winters displayed the loan application on the courtroom's projection screen. "Can you explain to the jury what irregularities you discovered in this application?" Briggs glanced nervously toward Kenneth Phillips before answering. The application showed several discrepancies. The reported annual revenue appeared to be inflated by approximately 30% compared to the supporting documentation. There were also undisclosed outstanding debts and an outdated property valuation. And based on your professional experience, were these innocent mistakes or deliberate misrepresentations? Objection, James called out, calls for speculation. Sustained, Judge Harmon ruled. Rephrase, Ms. Winters. Winters nodded. Mr. Briggs, in your professional experience, is it common for loan applicants to make such extensive errors accidentally? No, it's not common. Thank you, no further questions at this time. As James stood for cross-examination, he carried only a thin folder rather than his full briefcase. The strategic move wasn't lost on Judge Harmon, whose slight raised eyebrow suggested she recognized the confident gesture. Mr. Briggs, James began pleasantly, you testified that my client's application contained discrepancies. When did you first notice these issues? Briggs shifted uncomfortably. During the standard review process. I see, and when was that review conducted? Approximately 6 months ago when the application was submitted. James nodded thoughtfully. That's interesting because I have here the preliminary approval you issued for Mr. Coleman's loan. He extracted a document from his folder. This shows you found no issues with his application and recommended approval. This is your signature, correct? Briggs stared at the document. Yes, but further review. Further review came only after you had dinner with Kenneth Phillips at Morton's Steakhouse on March 12, isn't that correct? James interrupted, producing a receipt. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Prosecutor Winters shot to her feet. Objection, relevance. Your Honor, James responded calmly. The prosecution's entire case hinges on Mr. Briggs' credibility and the timing of his discovery of alleged fraud. The defense contends that external influences caused him to reverse his professional assessment. Judge Harmon considered briefly. I'll allow it, overruled. James turned back to the increasingly pale witness. Mr. Briggs, did you have dinner with Mr. Phillips, CFO of Westridge Development, on March 12? Yes, but it was just a business dinner. I have many such meetings. Do you typically discuss specific customer loan applications during these business dinners? Briggs swallowed hard. No, that would be inappropriate. Yet the very next day after this dinner, you flagged Mr. Coleman's previously approved loan application for serious discrepancies. Quite a coincidence, wouldn't you say? Objection, Winters called again. Argumentative. Sustained, rephrase, Mr. Washington, James nodded. Mr. Briggs, when did you inform Mr. Coleman about these alleged discrepancies? I didn't personally inform him. In fact, Mr. Coleman only learned his loan was denied when he received a letter also referring his case for criminal investigation. No opportunity to explain or correct any issues. That's highly unusual protocol for a long-standing business client, isn't it? I was following company procedures for suspected fraud. James raised an eyebrow. Were you also following procedures when you accepted this? He produced another document and handed it to the witness. This is an email offering you a position as Vice President of Loan Operations at Westridge Financial, a subsidiary being formed by Westridge Development. The date is March 15, 3 days after your dinner with Mr. Phillips and 2 days after you suddenly found fraud in my client's application. The courtroom erupted. Prosecutor Winters looked stunned, while Kenneth Phillips was frantically writing notes. Objection, Winters shouted over the commotion. This is outside the scope of evidence provided during discovery. Your Honor, James responded, these documents were obtained legally through subpoena to Mr. Briggs' personal email provider after the prosecution repeatedly failed to produce complete communications during discovery. We filed these subpoenas 3 weeks ago and notified the prosecution as required. Judge Harmon's expression darkened. Ms. Winters, were you aware of these communications? The prosecutor hesitated. We were not provided these specific emails by our witnesses, Your Honor. Mr. Briggs, James continued, seizing the moment, did you discuss these emails with the prosecution during your preparation for this trial? Briggs looked trapped. I don't recall specifically. Let me refresh your memory. James produced another document. This is the visitor log from the prosecutor's office showing you met with Ms. Winters and Mr. Phillips together for trial prep on 3 separate occasions. During these meetings, did you disclose your job offer from Westridge? I didn't think it was relevant. The gallery erupted again. Judge Harmon banged her gavel several times. Order, Mr. Briggs, you are under oath. Did you intentionally withhold information about a potential conflict of interest from this court? Briggs' composure completely collapsed. It wasn't like that. They said it was just a coincidence that the job offer had nothing to do with Coleman's case. Who is they, Mr. Briggs? James pressed. Mr. Phillips said. Briggs stopped abruptly, realizing what he'd revealed. At the prosecution table, Kenneth Phillips was now frantically gathering his papers and attempting to slip out of the courtroom. Judge Harmon noticed immediately. "Bailiff, please ensure Mr. Phillips remains in this courtroom," she ordered sharply. Ms. Winters approached the bench immediately. As the prosecutor moved forward, looking visibly shaken, James returned to the defense table where Marcus Coleman sat with tears in his eyes, watching the systematic demolition of the case against him unfold. "This isn't over," James whispered to his client, "but we've just cracked it wide open." Judge Harmon's chambers had never felt so tense. The court had been adjourned for a 1-hour recess following Briggs' damning testimony, and now Judge Harmon sat behind her desk facing Prosecutor Winters, James Washington, and court-appointed ethics counsel Patricia Rodriguez. "Ms. Winters," Judge Harmon began, her voice controlled but severe, "I want to be absolutely clear about what has transpired. Documents suggesting witness tampering, evidence suppression, and potential collusion between the prosecution and a corporate entity were not disclosed during discovery. Please explain." Winter's normally confident demeanor had crumbled. "Your Honor, I was informed by Mr. Phillips that his communications with Mr. Briggs were standard business discussions unrelated to this case, and you accepted that without verification." Judge Harmon's tone was incredulous. "I had no reason to doubt." "You had every reason to doubt," Judge Harmon interrupted, "especially when your key witness was offered a lucrative position by a party with direct interest in the outcome of this case." James remained silent, allowing the judge to lead the discussion. His earlier courtroom victory still felt surreal, but he knew the case was far from resolved. "Your Honor," Winters attempted again, "I was not personally aware of the extent." "Your awareness is not the issue," Judge Harmon cut in. "Your responsibility is, as lead prosecutor, the buck stops with you." She turned to the ethics counsel. "Ms. Rodriguez, your assessment?" Rodriguez straightened in her chair. "Based on the evidence presented, we have clear grounds for immediate dismissal of all charges against Mr. Coleman with prejudice. Additionally, I'm recommending a formal Bar Association investigation into Ms. Winters' conduct and a separate criminal investigation into potential witness tampering and obstruction of justice by Kenneth Phillips." "I concur," Judge Harmon said firmly. "Mr. Washington, your thoughts?" James leaned forward. "The defense moves for immediate dismissal with prejudice, Your Honor. Furthermore, given the evidence of corporate misconduct aimed at forcing my client off his property, we intend to file civil charges against Westridge Development immediately." Judge Harmon nodded. "Ms. Winters, do you wish to make any statement before I rule?" The prosecutor looked defeated. "The state acknowledges the serious issues raised and will not oppose dismissal of charges." "Very well," Judge Harmon stood. "Let's return to the courtroom." When they reconvened, the packed gallery fell silent as Judge Harmon addressed the court. "In light of evidence presented during today's proceedings, this court finds that the prosecution's case against Marcus Coleman has been irreparably compromised by misconduct. All charges are hereby dismissed with prejudice." Marcus Coleman broke down in tears at the defense table as James placed a supportive hand on his shoulder. "Furthermore," Judge Harmon continued, "I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for potential charges against Kenneth Phillips for witness tampering and obstruction of justice. Mr. Phillips will surrender his passport to the court before leaving today." Phillips, who had been prevented from leaving earlier by the bailiff, now sat ashen-faced beside his personal attorney who had arrived during the recess. "Ms. Winters," Judge Harmon's gaze shifted to the prosecutor, "I am referring your conduct in this matter to the State Bar Association for review. Your failure to properly supervise this prosecution and ensure disclosure of exculpatory evidence represents a serious breach of professional ethics." Winters stared straight ahead, her career effectively in ruins. Judge Harmon's attention turned to James and his client. "Mr. Coleman, while this court cannot undo the damage this prosecution has caused to your reputation and business, please know that the record will clearly reflect your complete exoneration." "Thank you, Your Honor," Coleman managed through his tears. "Court is adjourned." The gavel fell with finality. As the courtroom began to clear, reporters rushed to the hallway to set up for the inevitable press statements. James guided Coleman through a side door to avoid the immediate media crush. In a quiet conference room, Coleman finally spoke freely. "James, I don't know how to thank you. They almost took everything from me, my business, my reputation, maybe even my freedom." "It's not over yet," James replied. "Westridge still wants your property and they've shown they're willing to play dirty, but now we have leverage for a counterattack." "What's our next move?" Coleman asked, wiping his eyes. "We file a civil suit against Westridge for conspiracy, tortious interference, and defamation. We'll demand damages far exceeding what they would have paid to buy your property legitimately." A knock at the door interrupted them. Judge Harmon's clerk entered. "Mr. Washington, the judge would like to see you privately before you leave." James nodded. "I'll be right back," he told Coleman. In her chambers, Judge Harmon had removed her robes and looked surprisingly vulnerable. James, I've recused myself from any future proceedings related to Coleman's civil case. I wanted you to hear it from me directly. I understand, Your Honor. Drop the formalities, James. We're family right now, she sighed heavily. What happened to you this morning with Officer Sloan, it's not the first time, not in this courthouse, not in this city. I know Aunt Evelyn, but it might be the first time someone paid so dearly for it. Her eyes met his. The chief judge called during recess. Sloan's record has been flagged with similar incidents involving 3 other black attorneys and 1 paralegal over the past 2 years. All complaints were buried. James absorbed this information silently. This case has exposed rot in our system, not just Westridge's corruption but prejudice within our own courthouse. She stood and embraced her nephew briefly. Your father would be proud of you today, not just for winning but for maintaining your dignity throughout. Thank you, James said, emotion finally breaking through his professional veneer. Now go finish what you started, she said, returning to her judge persona. Make them pay for what they tried to do to your client. As James left the chambers, he felt a new resolve forming. What had begun as a simple fraud defense had evolved into something far more significant, a chance to challenge not just one corporation's corrupt tactics but systemic injustice itself. 3 weeks after the dramatic dismissal of charges against Marcus Coleman, the landscape had changed dramatically. James sat at his office desk reviewing settlement offers from Westridge Development while CNN played on mute in the background, showing footage of Kenneth Phillips being escorted into the federal courthouse to face charges. The story had exploded beyond local news. Black attorney HANDCUFFED in court EXPOSES corporate conspiracy read national headlines. Civil rights organizations had organized protests outside Westridge headquarters, and the company's stock had plummeted 17% since the scandal broke. A knock interrupted James' concentration. Come in. His assistant Lisa entered. Mr. Coleman is here for your 2 p.m. Great, send him in. Marcus Coleman entered, looking noticeably different from the man who had sat beside James in court 3 weeks earlier. Gone was the constant anxiety that had shadowed him for months. Instead, he walked with confidence, dressed in a sharp new suit. James, good to see you. They shook hands warmly. You're looking well, Marcus. First good night's sleep I've had in months, Coleman replied with a smile. The barbershop is packed. Turns out being the victim of corporate conspiracy is good for business. Everyone wants to hear the story firsthand while getting a haircut. James laughed. Glad something positive came from all this. Please sit down. We have some decisions to make. Coleman settled into the chair across from James' desk. What's the latest? James opened a folder. Westridge is desperate to settle. Their legal position is untenable, their public image is in shambles, and their investors are in revolt. They've offered $3.2 million to drop all claims. Coleman whistled. That's 4 times what they originally offered for the property, and it comes with no requirement to sell. You'd keep your barbershop and get the settlement. Sounds too good to be true, James nodded. In many ways, it is. Here's what they're not telling you. Their insurance won't cover acts of deliberate fraud or conspiracy. This settlement would come directly from company coffers, and they're hoping to solve this quietly before their annual shareholder meeting next month. What do you recommend? James leaned forward. Honestly, reject it. My team has uncovered evidence that Westridge has done this to at least 4 other small business owners in different neighborhoods. They've established a pattern of forcing out family businesses through questionable tactics. So we could get more. It's not just about money, Marcus, it's about accountability. If we take this to trial, everything becomes public record. Other victims might find justice too. Coleman considered this thoughtfully. My father always said that standing up for what's right matters more than any payday. It's your decision, James reminded him. The settlement would certainly secure your financial future. What about Officer Sloan and that prosecutor, Winters? What's happening with them? James gestured to a different folder. Sloan has been terminated from courthouse security. The investigation revealed a pattern of discriminatory behavior that had been repeatedly reported but ignored. As for Winters, she's facing disciplinary hearings with the Bar Association next month. Her career as a prosecutor is effectively over. Coleman shook his head. All because you walked into that courtroom that morning. Sometimes justice needs a catalyst, James replied. But this goes beyond what happened to me. This is about systems that protected Sloan despite multiple complaints. It's about corporate power being weaponized against small business owners like yourself. A knock at the door interrupted them as Lisa peeked in. Sorry to interrupt, but there's someone here who insists on seeing you, Mr. Washington. A Mrs. Diane Taylor? James looked surprised. Send her in. An elegant older black woman entered, her posture proud despite her evident age. Mrs. Taylor, James stood immediately. I wasn't expecting you. I apologize for interrupting, she said, her voice carrying the slight tremor of age but maintaining clear authority. But when I heard about your case, I knew I had to come. James quickly made introductions. Marcus, this is Diane Taylor. She owned Taylor's Bakery in Westside for over 40 years. Mrs. Taylor, this is my client, Marcus Coleman. Recognition dawned on Coleman's face. Taylor's Bakery. My mother used to take me there every Sunday after church. You made those incredible sweet potato pies. Mrs. Taylor smiled warmly. That was my grandmother's recipe. Her expression turned serious. Mr. Washington, I lost my bakery to Westridge 2 years ago. They claimed my building violated code regulations that suddenly appeared after I refused their offer. The repairs would have cost more than I could afford, so I had no choice but to sell. James and Marcus exchanged glances. Mrs. Taylor, would you be willing to make a formal statement about your experience? James asked. That's why I'm here. After seeing your case on the news, I contacted 3 other business owners who lost their properties to Westridge under similar circumstances. We're all willing to testify. The energy in the room shifted perceptibly. What had been a single case of corporate bullying was transforming into evidence of a systematic campaign against minority business owners. Marcus, James said, turning back to his client, still want to take that settlement? Coleman's jaw set with determination. Not a chance. Mrs. Taylor, I'm honored to meet you. My father used to say good pie was proof that God loves us. I think you showing up here today is another kind of proof. James pulled out his legal pad. Mrs. Taylor, let me take your statement, then I think we need to contact the others you mentioned. He glanced at Coleman. With your permission, I'd like to expand our case into a class action lawsuit against Westridge. Coleman nodded firmly. Do it. This isn't just about my barbershop anymore. As James began taking Mrs. Taylor's statement, his phone buzzed with a text message from his mother. Just saw Phillips on the news being charged. Your father would be so proud. You're changing things, son. For the first time since the case began, James felt the full weight of what they were accomplishing. This wasn't just about one man's business or one attorney's humiliation. They were challenging a system that had operated unchecked for years, silently stripping away generational wealth and community landmarks from black neighborhoods. Let's make sure this never happens to anyone else, James said, his professional detachment momentarily giving way to personal conviction. 6 months later, the grand courtroom of the federal building fell silent as Judge Raymond Wilson entered. Unlike the county courthouse where James had been handcuffed, this federal courtroom represented the culmination of a journey that had expanded far beyond a simple fraud case. James stood at the plaintiff's table, now representing not just Marcus Coleman, but 12 other business owners who had fallen victim to Westridge Development's predatory tactics. The class action lawsuit had drawn national attention, with civil rights leaders and business organizations filling the gallery. All rise, the bailiff announced. The United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia is now in session, the Honorable Judge Raymond Wilson presiding. Once everyone was seated, Judge Wilson addressed the court. Today we conclude the case of Coleman et al. Versus Westridge Development Corporation. The jury has reached a verdict after 3 days of deliberation. He turned to the jury box. Madam Foreperson, have you reached a unanimous verdict? A middle-aged woman stood. We have, Your Honor. Please state your verdict for the record. In the matter of Coleman versus Westridge Development, on the count of conspiracy to defraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of discriminatory business practices, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of tortious interference with business relationships, we find the defendant guilty. Marcus Coleman gripped James' arm tightly as the verdicts continued, each one affirming what they had fought so hard to prove. Diane Taylor, seated directly behind them, wiped tears from her eyes. On the matter of damages, the foreperson continued, we award the plaintiffs compensatory damages in the amount of $42 million. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Additionally, we award punitive damages in the amount of $125 million to be distributed among the plaintiffs according to the court's determination of individual harm suffered. The courtroom erupted. Judge Wilson banged his gavel several times. Order, order in the court. When silence returned, Judge Wilson addressed the defendants. Westridge Development, you have engaged in a systematic campaign to deprive minority business owners of their property through fraud, intimidation, and abuse of regulatory systems. This verdict sends a clear message that such practices will not be tolerated in our society. He turned to James and the plaintiffs. Mr. Washington, you and your clients have performed a public service by bringing these practices to light. This court commends your persistence and courage. Thank you, Your Honor, James replied, his voice steady despite the emotion of the moment. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell for the final time. As people began filing out, Marcus embraced James tightly. We did it. We actually did it. You did it, James corrected him. You chose to fight when taking the settlement would have been easier. Diane Taylor approached, her eyes still glistening. My husband built that bakery with his own hands. He didn't live to see it taken away, but he's watching today. I feel it. News crews waited outside the courthouse, but James led his clients through a side exit to a private conference room where they could process the verdict together. The 12 plaintiffs, barbershop owners, restaurateurs, tailors, and other small business people gathered in a circle, many embracing or wiping away tears. "What happens now?" asked Gerald Thompson, who had lost his tailor shop 2 years earlier. "Westridge will likely appeal," James explained, "but they're already facing federal indictments, shareholder lawsuits, and the resignation of most of their board. The company may not even exist by the time this case finishes working through the appeals process." "And Kenneth Phillips," Marcus asked, "pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for testimony against other executives. He'll serve at least 3 years in federal prison." Diane Taylor smiled sadly. "Money won't bring back my bakery. That building is gone, they put up luxury condos. But the settlement will allow you to rebuild somewhere else," James reminded her. "And more importantly, the court has ordered the creation of a community business fund from the punitive damages. It will provide low-interest loans to minority business owners in the neighborhoods Westridge targeted." Marcus nodded appreciatively. "So something permanent comes from all this." "Exactly. This was never just about winning a case, it was about changing a system." As the group dispersed, James checked his phone to find a text from his aunt, Judge Harmon. "Historic verdict. Your father would have been so proud. I certainly am." James was packing up his briefcase when his assistant Lisa appeared at the door. "There's someone here to see you." Officer Derek Sloan entered hesitantly, looking markedly different from the arrogant man who had handcuffed James 6 months earlier. His face was haggard, his posture diminished. "Mr. Washington," he began awkwardly, "I wanted to apologize in person." James regarded him carefully. "Why now?" "I've been doing a lot of thinking since I lost my job, took some courses at the community center about bias and privilege." Sloan looked down. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, just wanted you to know I recognize what I did was wrong." James remained silent for a moment. "What are you doing now?" "Security at a warehouse, night shift. It's all I could get with the record of my firing." James nodded. "Accountability has consequences, Officer Sloan, but so does growth." He reached into his pocket and handed Sloan a business card. "My friend runs a program helping former law enforcement transition to community service roles. Tell him I sent you." Sloan looked surprised. "Why would you help me?" "Because this was never about punishing individuals, it was about changing systems." James closed his briefcase. "Use this opportunity to be part of that change." After Sloan left, James stood alone in the conference room, reflecting on the journey that had begun with a humiliating incident and culminated in transformative justice. His phone buzzed with another message, this one from his mother. "Coming to celebration dinner tonight. So proud of my son. Bringing sweet potato pie from new bakery. Mrs. Taylor's granddaughter opened it last month." James smiled. Sometimes justice looked like courtroom victories and multi-million-dollar verdicts. But sometimes it looked like a new bakery opening, traditions continuing, and communities rebuilding. As he finally left the courthouse, a young black law student approached him shyly. "Mr. Washington, I've been following your case. You've inspired me to go into civil rights law." "What's your name?" James asked. Michael Robinson." James shook his hand firmly. "The work continues, Michael, and now it's your turn to carry it forward." The verdict hadn't just changed the trajectory of James's career or secured justice for his clients. It had created ripples that would continue long after the headlines faded, inspiring new advocates, changing corporate behavior, and reminding the powerful that accountability would always find them eventually. True justice, James realized, wasn't a destination but a continuous journey forward. And today, they had taken a significant step in the right direction.